The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the chairman, my colleagues, Mr. Holt from New Jersey, Mr. Sarah from California, Mr. Honda from California, Mr. Ellison from Minnesota for joining me in sponsoring this legislation and bringing it to the floor today. I remember when we had this legislation in the full committee by Chairman Conyers. About a week earlier than that, I had taken my 10-year-old down to Selma for the anniversary of the march over the bridge. It was his birthday gift, and we went on that march with John Lewis. And through the museums we walked through, my son and I were reminded of how the state was used to intimidate voters from exercising their right to vote. And America reached out and widened the circle of democracy by ensuring that those who wanted to exercise their right to vote had a chance to vote. That week when I came back from Selma, we were in the full committee marking up this legislation. And what had happened, and I noted then in the committee and others had noted, and it was not unique, is that the baton of intimidation had been transferred from the state to parties. They intimidated voters using leaflets to falsify voting places, days of voting, what information was required to vote. Phone calls had been used. All types of information to basically dissuade Americans from exercising their right to vote. That used to be through the 60s, the early 50s, the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, etc. That was the voice of our state governments and apparatus, to intimidate voters. That insane act of intimidation in communities across America and neighborhood had now been, that baton had been passed to state parties who are doing the same thing, suppressing people's right to exercise their right to vote. 3 years ago, in this hall, in the President of the Union, he recognized a young woman from Iraq who voted. She held up her purple finger. Colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle, they also marked their finger purple, recognizing the importance of voting. And that Iraq and the people of Iraq, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd, had taken that step of courage and voted. She came here at the State of the Union in this hall, the hall of democracy that people around the world look at, and said, "You protected our right to vote." This legislation is intended to ensure that individuals do not receive phone calls lying and deceiving about where they vote. They do not receive leaflets telling them they need other information than they properly need to vote. And most importantly, that the location of where they're voting had been changed when it never had been changed. All in an attempt to suppress the voting by individuals across communities and to depress the turnout of people who wanted to vote on Election Day. The chairman of the committee noted other things we have to do, like the paper trail for voting, to ensure the integrity on Election Day. This legislation ensures that if you try to use the voice of and the acts of intimidation to deprive people the right to vote, the United States government, with the full force of its laws, will say there's a higher penalty, and you will pay a price for that act of deception. I commend members of both sides of the aisle for bringing up this legislation. It's bipartisan nature, and in its finest sense, it speaks to the voice of democracy. Whether our policy differences on other subjects, we ensure that when people want to vote, they have a right to vote, and that the agencies of both our parties and our government don't try to intimidate people from exercising that right, but encourage them to vote. And that is what the act here is, and I'm proud that this legislation receives bipartisan support, but wide support of both parties, because it speaks to what is so appropriately the American way and what is right about voting. And so nothing is more American than voting, and nothing can be more un-American than deceiving one from taking the right to vote. And I want to thank the chairman for bringing this legislation to the floor today. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlemen.